yesterday the talk got a little emotional. We saw some results that raised people's interest and raised people's emotions. So I was thinking whether to try to make this answer these emotions, but I think it might end up sparking even more. So I guess future research is the only answer to calming down those emotions. So now I will present a little bit more of the technical aspects of how historical GDP is calculated, how we did it for the interwar period, how we did it for the Soviet period, so that it's more or less clear to people that we're not inventing these numbers or trying to push through some political agenda, but rather trying to find the truth. So what we knew about the Baltic States up until the beginning of this project, probably all of you have heard of the term the Baltic Tigers, such an impressive growth pattern that we had up until the 2008 crisis. And okay, it's not, the pointer is not showing the screen. Anyway, you can see...
It's going on the wall. So
yeah, doesn't matter. We can see that the growth rate in the first decades of the 2000s, after 1995.
Adomas, sorry, but you should somehow manage to speak in microphone.
Oh, the
microphone. Or you can take another one, just, yeah. If you go there, then it's okay. You'll be, yeah, they accepted, yeah.
You know what, I'll probably stay here.
Okay.
That's fine. In any case, you can see that in the first 15 years, up until 2008, the growth rate was probably even unsustainably high. Those Baltic Tigers, the growth of the Baltic Tigers was not very sustainable, but it's still impressive. And I could distinguish a tiger whenever I see growth rates 2 times higher than, let's say, European Union's average. And that's what happened since 2010 as well. European Union, compared to the Baltic States, is almost stagnating in the last decade as well. So the Baltic States have been a success story for the last 20-25 years, and all we know from history is that it used to be an agrarian, agricultural periphery 100 years ago. So the long-run question that our data can help answering is, how does an agricultural periphery devastated by conflicts, by depopulation, deportation, switching from markets to forced command systems, still manage to achieve positive growth and continue converging towards the Western levels? Another question is, if the Baltic States are such a unique example of growth today, small countries able to achieve growth in a turbulent world of the 2020s, is it something that we did in the last years that is so specific, or maybe it's inside us or inside our history of the whole 100 years that we're able to reproduce better growth than our neighbors? And also, as yesterday I pointed out, this data allows us to more firmly answer the question whether the Baltics are part of Eastern Europe, Northern Europe. So we will touch upon that a little bit. And one funny thing is that I recently watched a video from 1989 amidst the protests in Vilnius. There were some people gathered, and there was an old Russian-speaking lady, older, not old, and she couldn't understand why the Baltic people are protesting. Why are they demanding independence? And at one point she says, my friends who come from Russia, they say that you guys live like in America. This is the west of the USSR. Why would you ever want to get away from this if you are in such a comparatively good position? So now this data will firmly answer you how far we were from America and how far that lady was from the truth. So again, a little bit about my work. So I've been constructing the GDP data sets for the Baltic States since 2018, beginning from Lithuania, now encompassing all of the Baltic States. And I'm finishing my PhD at the University of Oxford this year, hopefully successfully. And besides that, my second job is cartography. I create maps. I draw historical and modern maps in vintage style. So if anybody's interested in that, we can talk about it later. I never skip a chance to promote myself a little. Here's a map that kind of leads towards our discussion. This is the blanks of in the world GDP. GDP is the most important economic indicator, and each country which wants to exist today needs to have that data. Now, if we look at the interwar period, so 100 years ago, there are so many blanks in the world that are still not filled. So we don't know anything about the interwar growth in Africa, in many of the Asian countries, and sadly, we did not know a lot about the Baltics as well. If you look at Europe, in the interwar period, and arguably in this period modern economic thought, the Keynesian economic thought was formed, we didn't have any data to base our own experiences on because we didn't just have it at all. And the only countries, actually Iceland should be colored, there is that data, but I couldn't find it in the Madison project. So Baltics were the only gaps remaining in Europe. Now, if we look at the Soviet period, we get even a worse situation. Almost in the entire world, only the post-Soviet countries and some of the lesser developed regions scattered across the globe didn't have any growth, aggregate growth data. So it is apparent that we were lagging behind and we were basing our economic policies only based on the last few decades of data because we didn't have anything longer term, while other countries could develop their own post-Keynesian policies. Simply look at their experience during the interwar period. So our job has been to close this gap, of course. You might ask, why GDP? There are issues with the GDP estimations. People say it doesn't show economic inequality. Again, repeating myself from yesterday, GDP is a decent indicator of living standards and happiness for average countries, average normal countries. If we look at Africa, if we look at Middle East, which are oil-rich countries, you might see that happiness is low there because most of the people are living in misery, but GDP per capita is very high because the oil magnates are driving it up, average-wise. If you look at Africa, the situation is reverse. So many countries are super poor, but Nigeria, for some reason, is very happy. You can ask them why, but if you look at the average countries like Lithuania, Latvia, France, Germany, Netherlands, an increase in income per capita usually leads to an increase in reported happiness. Those people, when asked, fairly respond more often that they're happy. So it's a decent indicator of living standards, and it's the only economic monetary indicator of living standards, because HDI, for example, or happiness index are indexes. You cannot measure it in dollars, euros, or anything else. So I argue that GDP is not the best, but it's the only one we can reasonably use, especially for extended periods of time. So our project actually began even before it officially began. So Estonians were the first to produce interwar GDP series in 2005. We tried to improve them a little bit. Martin has done it a few years ago. I extended it this year to cover the entire interwar period. And then there was a huge gap until 2018 when this whole process really kicked off. So in 2018, 2019, there were first estimations of Lithuanian GDP, of indirect estimates by Zenonas and Jurgita for all of the Baltic states. In 2022, already part of this project, we estimated the Latvian first robust interwar GDP figure, and then extended next year both Lithuanian and Latvian figures to the whole interwar period. So interwar period was by 2023 fully covered, and as it happens with most of the projects, the last year is the most productive. So in 2024, early 2024, late 2023, we were able to adjust the existing 1990 figures and get the uninterrupted series for the entire Cold War period up until 1995, and then connect these figures to the existing World Bank, Eurostat, and Madison Project figures of post 1995. Connecting, anchoring, that is another issue. I will not spend too much time on this. If anybody's interested in the specifics of how you connect, you know, new figures with existing ones, we can discuss it later on or in the discussion. So some basic methodological principles that we should touch upon, and I will be expecting some questions from Ola's team from Norway about the way we extrapolate them. But in any case, for most countries that either don't have enough data for income or expenditure, we use the production side approach to estimate historical GDP statistics. And while in modern days you would have every year a collection of data on each economic sector, agriculture, industry, services, construction, and stuff like that, you gather income on value added, on output and consumption. The difference is the value added this sector creates. You add it up and you get the GDP. So that happens in modern days. For historical periods, we don't have enough data to do that. So what we do, first of all, is we choose a base year. A year where we have good data on all of the economy, at least the best data we can get. So for interwar period, in Latvia's case, for example, that was 1935. So then we estimate the value added of each economic sector for that base year, which in this case is 1935. And then we use correlated data, like amount of milk from a cow. Let's say if we don't have monetary data on how much the milk sector increased from 1935 to 1936, but we know that the amount of milk produced increased from 10 million liters to 20 million liters, then we can more or less safely assume that the size of milk sector increased 2 times. So of course this has deflation issues when you have increasing productivity. Let's say if less and less feeding material is needed for each cow to produce 1 liter of milk, we should adjust for that. But at least for the interwar period, we can more or less safely assume that there were no big increases in the productivity or relative prices of feedings versus milk. So we assume that these correlated data provide us with the series of growth. So each economic sector, beginning from milk production, ending with metals or banking or whichever sector we look at, we try to find some correlated series, and then we extrapolate each sector and then combine it to get the GDPs of the whole economy in the whole period. So for interwar period, in Lithuania's case, the base year was 1937. In Latvia's case, was 1935. For the Soviet period, the same thing was done using 1990. So 1990 was the base year. The issue with the Soviet period is that we can in no way use the monetary data in constant or whatever rubles. Why? Because prices in the Soviet Union were determined by the state, and therefore monetary indicators are not very useful. In the Soviet period, we always had to dig into these physical indicators, and according to the CIA, which calculated GDPs for the entire Soviet Union, this is the way to go, and more or less the only way to go if you want to cover the whole period. You can have several scattered years being covered by these in-depth calculations, but if you want to cover the entire period, you will eventually have to resort to using physical indicators such as milk tons, such as tons of metal produced, and stuff like that. Right, so once we aggregated all the data and got all of the results, we started analyzing them, and I will show you some of the graphs, some of the slides, which you know, show the significance of the Baltics and their interesting growth patterns. Here, the Baltics are the green line, they are aggregated together. Nordics are the blue line aggregated together, and the European Union, including the UK, in its current borders plus the UK, is the red line. So, from very far perspective, it almost looks like we have a similar growth trends. It's not that different. It's not that we're going all the way down and they're going all the way up. The difference is that our growth has been consistently hindered by international shocks and especially war devastation. So if we look at the very beginning, which is 1913, 1 year before the First World War, the Baltics seem to be fairly well off, not too far from the rest of Europe, but then it seems like the First World War hit us way more than the rest of Europe. Then we have quite decent growth, and especially if we compare to the EU, it seems like in the 1930s we are growing even faster than they are. But then another war, and bam, we're down again, way more than they are. Then during the Soviet period, up until 1970s, it seems like the productivity of Lithuanians, Latvians and Estonians kept on increasing, and it seemed to be looking well, at least in the average productivity of the Baltic employees, not maybe their living standards. And then bam, 1970s, 1980s, there's complete stagnation in the whole socialist bloc, and that includes the Baltic states. Europe and the Nordics are still firmly growing, maybe not as fast as before, and the gap is starting to increase. And then what happens in the 90s? Bam! Another shock. There's no shock in the Nordics, there's no shock in EU and EU average, because they were not part of the Soviet Union. And we have the huge shock, and even in 2008 crisis, our shock was more pronounced than in the rest of Europe. So it seems like we have the potential to grow, and that potential is more or less similar to the Western potential of growth. It's just that it only happens when we are allowed to grow without any international shocks. Just leave the Baltics alone and probably we will be best. Now, I distinguish 4 periods of exceptional Baltic strive to reach the European Union's levels, and that would be first before the First World War, then during the Great Depression. It seems like the Baltics, and I will look at it in a little bit more detail afterwards, because it's probably the period we should be the most proud of. These were the periods when we were approaching European levels much faster than the rest of East Central Europe. East Central Europe, which is Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, now Czechia and Slovakia, these countries seem to share the history with us, right? They had the same war devastation, they were occupied by the same empires, they were coerced into the Soviet sphere of influence at least. But it seems like they're not sharing the same economic trends as we had. Even in the Soviet period, our growth seemed to have been more positive than theirs, and only in the last few decades, you know, our growth patterns were kind of the same, and we're approaching the EU levels as fast as the rest of the Eastern European region. But in my opinion, this distinguishes the Baltics in the sense that we were hit by international crisis as much as the rest of Eastern European area, but when we had a time and we were allowed to freely grow and converge, we did it better than Poles, Hungarians, Czechoslovaks and others. Now the interwar is the period I think we should fix in our minds as one of the success stories, especially for Latvia and Estonia. If we look at the graph on the left, we can see, I included the 1913 figures from Zenonas and Jurgita's study. Again, the slowdown, the decline that we had during the First World War is incredibly large. So the entire first decade of the interwar period was only meant for recovery from the First World War. The Baltic states, especially Latvia, which had the front line, extending right through the middle of the country during the First World War, was the most devastated by the war country in the whole Europe. It was the last to recover to its 1913 levels of all the European states. So all the more incredibly, these Baltic economies, all of them, if we look at the graph on the right, since the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, were able to achieve one of the fastest growth levels in the entire continent. So by 1929, all of them were recovered. All of Europe was already back on its organic growth rates. And that last period, those last 10 years of independence, proved to be the time when we were catching up with Europe the fastest. Europe is the dotted line there on the right, which seems to be growing the slowest, and our growth rates were no different from Finland's, and that's true for all of the Baltic countries. So that is in the first view, and I've already analyzed the interwar period in more depth. I believe it's mainly due to superior policies that the Baltic economists and Baltic, especially Latvian and Estonian policymakers took in the wake of the Great Depression crisis. So Great Depression worked as, well, one of the biggest impacts of the Great Depression was the complete contraction of world trade. And the whole crisis was distributed through the whole world through the flawly working gold standard. So the theory, and now most of the scientists agree, that if you see your trade levels contracting, your exports becoming less competitive on the onset of the Great Depression crisis, the faster you abandon the gold standard and either let your currency float or peg it to another currency which is floating, which in this case was the British pound, your income levels start to rise again faster, and that correlates with the recovery of trade. So since we have the data, it's the first time we can analyze the so-called trade to GDP ratios, or the openness to trade in the Baltic states. And we can see that, first of all, the green line, Lithuania, always had a very low trade level, and that's probably one of the reasons why it was not impacted by the crisis and was able to grow, is because it was a relatively closed economy. But Latvia and Estonia had trade levels similar to UK and Finland. So those were, in the 1920s, really successfully trading economies. But what happened when the crisis started, we can see both of these two lines are plunging down, almost reaching the Lithuanian level. And then what happens in 1931? Both Latvia and Estonia, they stop converting their currencies to gold, and therefore, in essence, abandoning the gold standard, and we can already see that their trade levels stop decreasing in that fast. And then Estonia devalued their currency in 1933, completely abandoning the gold standard and deciding to stick to the sterling bloc together with the UK. And in 1933, their trade levels are going up already, that fast. Latvia postponed its decision up until 1936, and again in 1936, the red line is going up. So this kind of allows us to see that a small country, which seems to be embroiled in the whole world, plunging towards the Second World War, closing down its trade, even such small countries could make a small difference, if their policies are quick and if they're sound. And I think what Olaf mentioned about the 90s, about the Estonian policies in the 90s, also confirms that. If you're not afraid to take bold policy actions, you might win. And in this case, and in the 90s case, Estonia was the clear winner. Latvia in 1930s was one of the winners as well. Lithuania, in my opinion, lost out. It could have devalued or at least started controlling its currency and would have seen even faster growth. Now, interwar modernization is another issue that I touched upon yesterday. Latvians are proud of their VEF factory, right? It's the radio factory that sprang up because of the state investments in the 1930s. And it's true that in all of the Baltic states, the fastest growing sector was industry, and those innovative branches of the industry were, of course, among the drivers of that growth. The yellow bars here show the industrial growth. So it's almost double the growth rate of the other sectors during the 1930s. So that is true. The issue is that throughout the entire interwar period, if we go back to this slide, the green sector, which is the agricultural sector in all of the Baltic countries, still continued to dominate. And industry, which is the black sector, only accounted for 20, maybe in Lithuanian case, even less than 20% of the GDP. So even if you have very fast growth in industry, it takes a lot of time for industry to, you know, double in size to at least be the size of the agriculture. And most of the overall growth was still in the hands of the agricultural sector. And agriculture, sadly, was not a fast modernizing sector. If we look at the number of tractors per million hectares, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia were still far behind the industrialized economies. Even though in the UK, obviously, agriculture was not as important as industry, they still were better modernized even in that sector. Another example of, limited success. In general, our success was great if we compare to our previous standings. But if we compare to global standings, if we look at, say, at the electrical energy generation, which is correlating with the amount of people living in cities, because cities usually have more electricity, number of people living in cities was still low in the Baltics, and therefore it reflects in the electricity data. Electric energy generation per capita in 1940 was way lower in the Baltic states than in the industrialized countries. So we were on the good path. It was a success story for the region east of, let's say, France or east of Germany, but it was a limited success in a way that we needed more time. Now, if we look at the occupation period, I still haven't spent enough time analyzing that. This is part of my thesis, and the thesis is not due until September, October, so I still have some time. But some general first impressions I will try to already share with you. So we can divide, I think, the occupation period into two parts. The first part is the pre-stagnation period when the Baltics seemed to be advancing fast. And now, to make it clear, yesterday we had an emotional discussion. GDP per capita in the Soviet system is not entirely reflective of the living standards. Why? Probably most of you have heard that half of the stuff, a lot of the stuff that the Baltics companies produced during the Soviet period were transitioned to the Soviet Union, and some people have called it involuntary foreign aid. So, you know, we have voluntary foreign aid that we give, let's say, to Ukraine right now. The foreign aid that we gave free of charge to the Soviet Union was obviously not a voluntary aid. So GDP and GDP per capita in Soviet period for the Baltic states, it shows the productivity of the Baltic worker. So it shows that the Baltic states, the people in the Baltic states up from 1966, all of the Baltic states were able to be more productive than the Soviet Union average. It's another story why this was all, half of it was shifted back to the Soviet Union, but the fact is Baltic workers were among the most productive in the whole Eastern Bloc. So whenever somebody asks whether life quality increased the same way, no, it didn't. But that's another story for another period of research. Now, if we look at the beginning of this growth, up until 1948, 47, 49, we see that all of the Baltics seem to be growing fast, even in the green line in Lithuania, because it's the post-war growth. Whenever you have a war devastation, usually coming back from that is fast enough. But once you reach a certain level, then the growth has to be organic, and as we saw in the 1930s, post-1929, okay, we have less time. But Jurgita told me I could spend a little bit more because their presentation is going to be shorter. So post-1929, the organic Baltic growth was fairly positive. Post-1949, it was terrible. Who can guess why? Up until Stalin's death, so 1949, 1953.
The largest sector was agriculture, and agriculture suffered from collectivization.
Yep, it's the collectivization. Especially pronounced in Lithuania, we see that up until 1953 there's almost complete stagnation, because all of the most productive farmers were shipped to Siberia, and whatever is left was, in the hands of the state, and nobody wants to productively plow the land that is, not your owned entirely. Now, after Stalin's death, we have the Khrushchev period, the period of warming, the thaw, and certain autonomy given back to the Baltic republics, and the regional economic planning seemed to have produced decent results. The forced industrialization, at least in the sense of productivity, worked up until 1970s, and the Baltics were, growing even faster than Soviet Union average, reported in GDP per capita. Both Latvia and Estonia always were above the Soviet average. Lithuania only surpassed it in 1966. Okay, we can also have later a discussion of what does that mean, but in general it means that life quality probably was improving, productivity was improving even faster, and the Baltics were becoming fast the most productive region of the Soviet Union. What happened in the later part of the occupation is, as I said before, a complete stagnation. In the entire communist bloc you had this stagnation, and it did not pass through the Baltics unnoticed. Absolutely, the Baltics were stagnating. The most interesting part here is that previously reported figures seem to show that in 1989 there was a big jump in Estonian GDP per capita. There was a reasonable jump even in 1990 in Latvian data. And when we recalculated all of that and we have the new results, the red line, the solid red line, which is Latvia's economic growth, we can see there's no growth from 1986 already. So 1986, even though moderately, was the last positive year, and from then on, Latvian economy was plunging down, and that plunge was accelerated, of course, in the transition crisis. Again, as mentioned before by Olaf, we can see that post-1990, Estonian, decline seems to be way more modest than in Latvia and Lithuania, and actually that is the period which brought Estonia forward. Up until then, Latvia and Estonia seemed to be on the same level. Lithuania was a little bit poorer. What happened in the 90s? Lithuania and Latvia equalized. We were the same poor, and Estonia managed to avoid the huge contraction that we had. And since then, Estonia were on the top. And I will look at that data later. But then, before that, I will show the reason why I think it's okay to show politically that there was growth in the Soviet Union. Of course there was growth in the Soviet Union. If we look at the last data point in 1939 and the first data point in 1995, still there was an increase in living standards, even if we look at the non-Soviet data. But if we would take the officially reported Soviet measures, which is the red line, we can see that compared to the newly estimated figures, the growth would have been even almost exponential. So that is the power of Soviet propaganda, and whenever somebody says that Lithuanian industry was growing that fast, or Baltic industry was growing that fast, it obviously wasn't. The growth rate should be divided by 2. And the last part, of course, is post-1990. We could call it an ongoing success story. The Baltic states have had the fastest growth levels in the whole of Europe, and we can see even in the last years the divergence flipped. If we had Estonia in the lead up until the 2008 crisis, Lithuania and Latvia were on the same level. Something happened during the 2008 crisis that left Latvia on the lowest path, and Lithuania managed to achieve better standards and even overcome Estonia. And comparatively, if we look at the interwar period, the level of European Union convergence that Latvia was able to achieve in 1938 was 90% of European Union's level. Today, even Lithuania and Estonia haven't reached that level, which means that Latvia in interwar period was more westernized than Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, and whichever of them you take, is today. So for us, probably, Lithuanians and Estonians, current period is the golden age. Latvia should be proud the most of the interwar period and try to do something in these days. So to conclude, definitely exceptional Baltic growth levels is not only a modern phenomenon, it has been repeated before, and in whatever system we are, we seem to be able to produce better results than our neighbors. Whether that is interwar independence and trade closing down in the whole world, whether that is the Soviet occupation period, and whether that is modern independence, we seem to be able to produce better growth results than our neighbors, and especially when we are left alone to have our independence and to grow in the capitalist system. How does that happen? Many things are not controlled by the Baltics, let's say free trade in the whole world or capitalist framework which was taken from us in 1940. What we can control as independent states is policy making, and it's clear that small states have been able to produce better growth through sound policies, and that's clear on the interwar example of Latvia and Estonia, and clear on the modern example probably of Estonia in the 1990s. So I'd argue that the Baltic economies should not be attached to Eastern Europe, because they were constantly, throughout the 4 different periods of growth, were able to overcome the Eastern European levels of growth. And by many times in the 1930s, they were negatively growing. We were among the best growing countries in the whole Europe. But even in the rest of the periods, the red bar is always a little bit lower than the green one, so it shows that the Baltics are exceptional in that sense, but also we're definitely not there to compare ourselves to the Nordic neighbors, maybe in the future, but as of today it seems like the Baltics are a unique small region of robust capitalist economies that should be treated and analyzed uniquely, both for the sake of our future growth, to develop our future growth policies based on our own experience, but also as examples for other countries which might transition to capitalism in the future. So I hope that was interesting, and we will probably have a discussion later.